So, I welcome everybody to this afternoon session here. I hope all of you are having a great time. So, the proposed title of this session is The Art of the Short Story. And I guess one way to begin this conversation for me is to uh, ask our speakers what they think about the short story in terms of the fact that because it's short, it can always afford to be experimental in nature. So, or is the short story a kind of a place where novelists or fiction writers prepare themselves for a longer, more rigorous, sustained form? Or is a short story an end in itself, where we try to master a form for what it is? So, what kind of how do you guys see the short story when you approached it? Yeah.
Hello. Yeah. So, the short story, I think when I started writing, 2010, I think, uh, I was attracted to the short story because it is something I could do quickly. I think it was a very, very practical decision. Uh, I worked a corporate job then, I work a corporate job now. So the short story always had this attraction that I could get in and I could get out very quickly, and that's pretty much why the first things I wrote in fiction were short stories, and then when you start writing it, you discover what the form can do. So yes, it has been a place where experimentation can happen, and but I think in that it is not very different from the novel. I think a novel is also more capacious, and a lot of experimentation can happen there as well. So, but yeah, the primary attraction to the short story was because it is short, and therefore, as a writer, you can learn your trade, so to speak, without having to commit yourself to a larger project. And it is only later that once you practice it and you do it badly, you do it well sometimes, that you discover what the form can do. And also as you grow as a reader, right, you see what other people have done, and that gives you more confidence. You want to try those new things, and you do them well, you do them badly again, and I think that's for me pretty much. I started with with writing short stories because they were the practical thing to do for me.
I think we'll have to do a little bit of a circus with this mic. Uh, can we extend this thing? Either the mic will fall or I will. If we could do something about this mic, which, uh, maybe pull it a little.
We
More.
can use this one.
No, but that's yours.
No, no, I have mine.
Oh, you have? Oh, then it's okay. The first published work of mine about many centuries ago was a short story, and that was just a page in a magazine. And later I realized that a short story is something which comes immediately, you observe something and there's an emotion attached to it, and then you write it down. And slowly I started experimenting with form, which is when I realized, after the short story, I went into poetry. Chronologically speaking, it's um, short story, poetry. Then I became a journalist and started writing columns and reports and interviews. Then came a play, and then came the novel finally. But through all this, I realized that the core of this writing, this muscle and the tissue and the soul of that story, belongs to the short story. And that is what sort of took me into the other forms like poetry and novel and things like that. For example, I can talk to you about two poems I wrote. One was after the Kumarakam boat tragedy. It affected me very badly, and I wanted to write a story about it. And then I realized it could be a poem. And with all sorts of things happening, and people were trying to get compensation, and people were mourning the dead. And there was this one small house where there was this blind woman. And she didn't know, there was this terrible silence in the house. She didn't know what it was until she realized that there was nobody else in the house but she after the tragedy, after the boat tragedy. So that was something which, with one poem, that entire short story could be enveloped in that one poem. Then I think it was basically one short story which from somebody else, a Malayalam writer, which took me where I wanted to go, which showed me where I wanted to go. I had watched this movie when I was very young called Bhargavi Nilayam, and the screenplay was by Bashir. And there was this ambience of a ghost story and a lot of songs, and I was very impressed by it. But much later, I read this short story named Neela Velicham, which was written by Bashir. And I realized how much deeper it went, even though he used simple language and it was a straightforward, Bashir's is never very straightforward, but straightforward narrative. It just went deep into me, and I knew that the short story was capable of so much more.
Thanks. I think one of the things that I'm fascinated about regarding the short story is, given the fact that it's short, we have the power to comprehend it in its whole. And there is this almost a rhetorical way of looking the short story as one single sentence. And to the best of my knowledge, because I've been following Tanuj's writing here and there for so many years, I think Tanuj has also written a story which is one single sentence or has a very, very long sentence. So, you know, it's as if the sentence is a unit of, you know, thought, which sort of then, through which you sort of think of your story. So, I mean, because for me that's a very fascinating idea, because on one hand it is a story, but you also, it is because it's short enough, you can also really think through the sentences. The sentences are not incidental, and like I said, the whole story can be one single sentence. So how is that process for you? Like, what does it mean to write a short story, for example, as one single sentence?
So the story being referred to is the story title Reasonable Limits, and it's a single sentence in the book. In the book length work Diwali in Muzaffarnagar, I think it runs for 6 pages, and I think the long sentence is an exciting problem to get into, because just how do you sustain the long sentence? It is made easier. I think there are certain kinds of stories for which certain sentence lengths, for example, might be more appropriate. So if there are two or three characters and we are going to hop from one to the other, I think one is going to find it very difficult to write that kind of story in a single paragraph, in a single sentence, over a long sentence. But that particular story is the interiority of this one person, and that made it easier. But I also wanted it to appear like a ball, of tangled thread. That was the image in my mind, and so it was like a series. So the thought stream doesn't really work very linear there in that story. And this guy goes from talking about his life at his office to something that's happening inside the office that will lead to people losing their jobs, and then he talks about a certain new process that is introduced at his workplace, where people who destaple documents, there are a bunch of people who receive documents that are stapled very heavily, and then some people have to destaple those documents, and people are hired to do that. and they bleed, their fingers bleed. And so this person discovers that at his workplace. And from there is this wild leap, and we go to the horrors of the 20th century. There's even talk of the Holocaust and so on. So to me, it was like a tangled bunch of thoughts, and the image in my head was a ball. And to render that on the page, I thought a single sentence would have been the best, and then it went on and on. I think sometimes when I read the story now, I don't really agree with myself, because there are a lot of semicolons, and one could argue that I should have just put a period there, like why did I artificially try to make it one sentence? But I think these, I'll have that thought one day, and then 2 days later I'll read the story and I'll like it again, as it is. So this keeps changing. But yeah, so, from your first question as well, so one enters this sort of story with a desire to experiment, to see whether I can do it, with the feeling that I think that I have a story that would be rendered well in such a format. And then you keep at it, and it happens. Some people like it, some people don't like it. That's okay. So yeah, that was my thing. And so I am attracted, even in my other fiction, to the long sentence. And if not the long sentence, there are other stories in which there are no paragraph breaks. And there again, I'm thinking of the story or the narrative as this really condensed whole. And then I feel sometimes when I'm writing this story that is supposed to be 4 pages, 5 pages, which to me is a shorter story, I feel that I want to bind the reader also so hard to it. I am desperate for the reader to read it in, like sometimes people, if it's a 20-page story, you will, put it down after 10 pages, come back to it after some hours or days. But I want to ensure with certain stories of mine that, they are read in one sitting. And sometimes these things happen because of that. So there's also another story, The Issue, which is a single paragraph. So it's not a single sentence. But there again, the idea was that this is this compact block of text, which may be difficult to enter, but once you enter, once you're through the first 3, 4, 5 lines, then you shouldn't be able to stop. And I think that's also to respond to what you said about the story being consumed in the whole. Right, and so this desire to control the reader, I think, makes fiction writers, use these methods, because I think we are control freaks, right? Like in the sense that we really want to control the character, we really want to also control the reader, and it's a violent act in the sense that when you read my story, I want you to read it precisely. I want to control you. So yeah, I mean, that's why that story came into existence here.
No, I mean, how do you look at the role of, writing individual sentences in your stories? Like, you may not have particularly written a story in a single sentence, but what is the value of the sentence in your story? Like, I mean...
Value of words is very much. The words in my novels, my poems, each word occupies a very, very heavy and special place in the thing. But what I'm more interested in telling you is this short story, the transmutability or the way it can change. You're not saying, I'll write a short story today and you write. You have a subject in mind and you wonder how to put it across. So is it a short story? Is it going to be a play? Is it going to be a novel? Or you can write just a poem with it, with the idea that has come to you. So there was this anthology from Rupa, where they had asked me to write, it was about Kerala. The entire, all the short stories were about Kerala. And they asked me to write something, and I wrote about Trivandrum, which is the city of my birth. So this was called Fort Lines, and it was set within the fort area of Trivandrum. And the first part of it was about an offense. Politically charged young student does something during his student agitation days, and there is an offense committed against somebody. And the second part of it is a retribution. So I was wondering, how could you write a short story where both the theme and the format sort of, respond equally? And so I wrote the first part of it, the offense part of it, was as a short story in prose. The second part of it was written as a small play. Now, you might think that when you're writing a play, it's a dramatic sort of thing. But the only dramatic thing about a play is when you're watching it. When you're writing it, it stops you. It's more challenging reading a play than watching a play. So here, the retribution, the justice in the end seeps through slowly. And that's why I thought this change in format would be good. And it was a unique thing, and I think there were a lot of people who enjoyed the story. So I guess there are certain things which you don't go about saying, and this is what I'm going to do today, or this is the experiment I'm going to do. But depending on the subject, you do that. For example, there was a short story I had written in a magazine called The Heritage. It was published by the Chandamama Group in Madras. This short story, I was sitting in that publishing house, in that editorial room, and there was this director of Malayalam cinema called K.S. Sedumadhavan, who was sitting along with me, and he said, I want to make this into a movie. It took some time. He couldn't, because he was working for a Tamil movie, and it didn't work out somehow or the other. But soon there was a competition, an all India competition by the Hindu and the Madras Players, the theatre group called Madras Players. And there was a play competition, play scripts competition. So I thought, if K.S. Sedumadhavan thought this could be made into a movie, why not make it into a play? It's about a village and two rival political people and a love story in between. And there's a holy man who comes in, and there's a mistaken identity. All that is there, and there's a lot of humor in it. So I wrote it as form of a play, and that play won the first prize. So a short story, which you take it into a different format altogether, a play or a poem, it's fun to play with these ideas, not the format. The format has to be rigorously sort of maintained, and you have to work on it. But it's fun to, see how much you can do with one idea. I have done it later also. I have done it in different formats, these ideas.
I thought the one question which I think we should get out of the way, because that was something raised by you when you said that you read somebody, I think Bashir, who showed you that this kind of writing is even possible, and inspired you in a certain way. So if I can ask you, both, if there is that one writer who got you some very, showed you the possibility of that form in a way that made the maximum impression on you. So, because that's something that all of us would like to know more. Yeah.
So for me, it was, who was it? I think it was Roberto Bolaño for me when I was starting. So, and Natasha Wimmer, I think, the translator. And he did a lot of things with the story, both the shorter story, which is, as I said, 2,000 words, 4-5 pages, that to me were very novel. at that time. But for me, inspiration for a short story can also come from a chapter in a novel, right? So, like for example, recently the Booker-winning novel, I think 2 years ago, Shaggy Bain, right? I think chapter 3 or chapter 4 is about this taxi driver and a day in the life of a taxi driver who is not the central character in the novel, and a splendid short story. I mean, even as a short story, it would be amazing. So sometimes you even segments of larger works, like I mean, like a novel, you do notice that there is a certain section here that reads as a whole. So, but for me, initially it was Roberto Bolaño. Then I think there would be too many to name. Among recent Indian writers in English, I think I really like the short stories by Anjum Hassan and Sonal Kohli. I think these two writers recently I've been very impressed by, have thought that maybe I should try something like this myself, or so things like that have happened. But yeah, initially 10-12 years ago when I started writing short stories, it was Roberto Bolaño, and he was kind of like a god at that time, because I think he was a global phenomena and you couldn't really escape it. And I think I was young and impressionable, so I was a big fanboy. Not so much now. I don't see myself going back to Roberto Bolaño anymore. But yeah, I have to take his name because he was a big deal for me. Yeah.
When I was growing up, I don't think I had any inspiration. Maybe something like Agatha Christie or R.K. Narayan was quite an influence on me. So that was it. But otherwise, it was just a dreamy sort of thing which culminated in a story. And then I would show it to somebody and they would say, okay, it's good or it's not good. And later it was just for these anthologies. I have never had a full anthology of my short stories published. It is just for various anthologies. But if you look at all those things down the years, I think there's been a fair number of stories, and I don't think an inspiration for me matters. It's only when I read the book or read the short story. Afterwards, it doesn't sort of stay on long enough for it to seep into a story that I'm writing. And even if I do that, when I'm editing it, that influence may not sort of last. I may edit out that a bit of it. So it's basically there is no the inspiration doesn't stick.
When you were speaking about the movies and script writing and the relationship between plays, I think that sort of brought me to one aspect of short stories, which at least to the best of my knowledge, I see many short stories to be very cinematic in nature. For example, the way you open a short story. I remember at least maybe perhaps a conversation with you, Tanuj, that you imagine that beginning to be the beginning of a film, right? And a certain image appears which you want to follow through. So visual, yeah. So basically the sense that a very cinematic imagination in some sense guides your short story. So do you have any responses to that? Like,
in my case, I'm sure it must have been the case that I write a short story, like some clear visual comes to you and you turn it to text and that's your beginning. But a lot of my stories are also very interiority driven, and so you start with thought rather than something that is so a character thinks something. I edit a literary magazine called the Bombay Lit Mag, and we read every submission. And so, for example, this quarter we'll be reading 350 stories. Okay, so in the course of editing this magazine for 10 years, I must have read thousands of stories. And you don't have the time to read a 20-page, 30-page story. You have to decide whether it goes to the next round or not. So beginnings play a crucial role, and I play the role of the editor with these stories. And I know the kind of beginnings that I don't like. You know, sometimes we'll find a story in our inboxes. You start to read it, and how does it start? A character is waking up, and they open the window, and they look out from the window. Very cinematic, right? You can visually see it. If the room is also well described, if the window is described, if the scene outside is described, you can see it. But half a page, 1 page is gone, you know, like, what is this going to be about? So I find myself rejecting those stories as an editor, okay? So for me, when I write a short story, it is always about, okay, 1 or 2 or 3 lines, and something has to be conveyed to the reader saying, you know, like, this is what this might be about. You know, I'm not talking about cinematic terms like hook. No, we're not starting with a cliffhanger, nothing like that, but some sort of contract establishment, which a lot of stories that I read in the TBLM inbox, there is no contract establishment for almost an entire page. And as an editor, you don't, as a reader, actually, you know, you don't feel that you want to continue. So I work, of course, I'm sure this is true of all short story writers. Beginnings are where most of the work is happening, you know, or the most effort from the writer goes into beginnings. And yeah, and what is cinematic in the sense that the difference between what is cinematic and what we might call novelistic is the difference of interiority only, right? The novelistic has the cinematic in it in its entirety. And added to that is the possibility that in a novel or in a short story, you might have a character just thinking something for 2 pages, right? Which would be very, very difficult to show in a movie. In a movie, you know, you can't reveal thoughts in a movie, right? So the novelistic always has had complete, you know, the cinematic completely almost inside it. And yeah, so beginnings, I try to make them interesting for the reader. And sometimes, again, speaking as a reader and as an editor, sometimes very specific date-time declarations, they work best. You know, like, it was the day of Diwali, it was around 3 in the afternoon. That's one of my stories, Diwali in Muzaffarnagar starts like this. And I mean, it's pretty plain, but it tells you precisely where we are, what time it is, and then the next sentence, I think 3 or 4 characters are introduced. So it's short, right? So you set up your landscape quickly. I think there's no time in a short story for a character to wake up and open a window, look outside, and only on the second page we discover what might happen.
This is something, the luxury of this can happen in a novel, but not in a short story, because the previous, not the previous novel, the one before that, my novel called Maria's Room. It was set in Goa, and it was not the usual sunny beaches and things in Goa, but a rainy season throughout, a dark and misty, mysterious sort of Goa. And I think I let myself loose and I described the entire sort of thing. So a lot of people told me about this descriptiveness and the way they could actually picture the thing. But any writer should be, I think, like what Ernest Hemingway is supposed to have said, but actually he didn't say that. Somebody said that and said, Ernest Hemingway said. Ernest Hemingway is supposed to have said, write while you're drunk, edit when you're sober. So it, actually he didn't, but somebody else said he said it. So that is the thing. Once all the purple passages are you sort of rankle when you go there and read it again, edit it afterwards. But I think there is a lot in a short story, as in poetry, that you leave to the reader. The reader's imagination nourishes what you have written, even if you only suggest things, even if you only write a color, write a shape, write a thought, write a bit of a conversation, it goes in and the reader's imagination nourishes the whole thing, and it lives after that, I think. So, which is precisely why no 2 or 3 or 4 readers agree with the quality or have a similar judgment on a short story. It differs according to their experience, according to their imagination, according to what they bring in, all that. So I think a short story is interesting in that you minimize. It's like a little drop of blue in a bucket of water, which will clean up the whole thing. But it's just one drop of blue. So that idea percolates and the reader does a lot of hard work after that, or the imagination.
Another kind of short story that is sometimes difficult to approve of as an editor who has to read hundreds is the story that starts with direct speech in the very first sentence. Hey, did you bring the apples I asked you to? Right? And that's the beginning of the story. And you don't know who is saying that to whom, right? And then this person responds, no, I forgot. So again, for me, that kind of story is one as a reader is like, we're talking about apples, who is talking, what is happening, etc. So for me, it has sort of become a practice that one will not start with direct speech. Likewise, I think that, so sometimes we at our magazine, we receive stories that go like, hey, the very first word is hey, and with Y, multiple Y's after HE. And that can sometimes be jarring because, like, just tell me who is haying whom, right? So, yeah, I mean, these are just experiences as an editor more than, I'm not really speaking as a writer, but yeah.
It's good that you're bringing your experience of, what it means to read as an editor, because that got me thinking into, understanding what is the status of the short story today, and in the other session, in the craft of writing, we were discussing whether there is a boom in non-fiction as opposed to fiction. For example, nowadays there's a lot of non-fiction. And then there was also this observation that nowadays many writers, they tend to write short novels a lot, right? So there's some reason why the short novel is again coming back in vogue. So likewise, what is there anything about the way we are in our current times, whether it is the mobile phone or the social media, the technologies that we use, that has an influence on, whether the short story is being read more or less nowadays. What I'm trying to ask is that genre dying, or is that genre again reviving itself because of all these habits of reading and, interacting with various discourses of our time? So what is your gut response to that?
There's no gut response. I've actually thought about this a fair bit. Orhan Pamuk's My Name is Red. In certain reviews, people did use the word encyclopedic novel, for that novel, because there is a lot of description of the art of miniature painting. I think in the 15th or 16th century Ottoman Empire, or whatever it was called then. I think what has happened with attention spans and so on is that the reader's patience for using the novel as a tool to learn something about the world has diminished. So there's lesser patience now, and this is just an opinion, right? There's no great deal of research behind this. The reader's patience for the encyclopedic novel is diminishing, right? Even if they did not know about miniature painting in 16th century Turkey, when you tell them that in a novel, the reader's reaction is, oh, I could have Googled this. I could have done it in my own time. Where's the story, right? I think that has happened. I don't know whether this will persist or not. Sometimes the classic forms, not so classic, but novel and short stories can again, probably the encyclopedic novel can come back, right? And we'll find certain readers who will be like, hey, I want to slow down, I want to use the novel to learn about the world, and so on. So there is that kind of pressure on the novel, which is relatively recent. You know, it's only in the last 10, 15 years where this pressure has come, that's saying, you know, get done with it, you know, like tell us the story. Which I think as novelists, if I as a novelist or a short story writer perceive this in the reader, then it is inevitable that I will adapt, right? Even if it is not very conscious, I will end up adapting to it and so on. I have never written anything as big as My Name is Red. I mean, I have not written a 500 pager, 600 pager. But I feel more and more convinced that I'll end up writing slim books or slim novels. Curiously, my short stories tend to be longer. So my short stories tend to be more than 10,000 words, which is around 40, 50 pages. Right? So usually short stories are 20 pages, 10 to 20 pages. So with the short story, I can go long, but it's still, in my head, it is still, the mode is smaller, right? Like, and the novels, I haven't written, I think, anything more than 240, 250 pages, which is going to continue. And even if I do get the energy at one point in time, say in 10 years, to write a big fat one, I think because condensing narrative and condensing everything is now a habit and will be even more so in the next years. By the time I start writing a big fat novel, I think it will take a lot out of me because I'll still be operating in that condensed way. And if it is a 500 pager, then I think it will be like writing a 1,000 pager. I don't know if that makes sense. So yeah, that's what I think. I think readership. So there are readers for novels. But there is a certain kind of novel that took its time, right? That no one has time for anymore.
I think about 2009 or 10 or something like that, there was a panel discussion, a debate in Bombay with, I was there, Gurcharan Das was there, Salma, the Tamil writer, was there. We were all shortlisted for a prize and we were all there, and there was a discussion. And the theme was, will Kindle replace books? I don't know. Kindle. Kindle. So, Kindle, including all the electronic things where you read stuff. Now we are in almost 20 years later. And I think these things go on. Like, we have this huge Mathrubhumi literary festival, and so many people from all over the place come, spend the entire day, 5 days here, and talk about books, read books, speak about books, listen to authors. And authors keep churning out books which are 500 pages and 600 pages, and I think this is something which, and it'll happen, it'll continue to happen. I think there is when I started, in fact, the book which I'm writing now, I mean, it's been 18 years since I started the book. I was a Charles Wallace scholar, I mean, Charles Wallace fellow in Scotland, and I wrote this story, and I thought it will be a short story, and then it decided it would not be a short story, it will become a novel, and it started writing itself. And through all the other things that I wrote, the short stories, another novel, many plays, children's books, many children's books, all that, this one sort of continued to grow with me. And now it's almost over. And I have never, ever in my life written something beyond 450 words, which is what this is threatening to do now. So I guess a writer, depending on what motivates him or her, does something, and then there are people who, the agents or the mediators and the editors, who will decide and whether it should be placed out there or not. And there are readers who come there and they make the decision whether to read it or not. Maybe the book is minimally read. Maybe the book is, because maybe it's won a prize or something like that, it gets more mileage. But I think we cannot say that we are seeing the horizon, we are seeing the end, we are seeing a little trend happening, a new trend happening, because all these things are coexisting, I feel.
In fact, on that note, one of the things that, this whole idea that, of course, we are talking about the art of the short story, and there is a presumption that all of us are either writing literary fiction or in some sense celebrate it. And yet, as we now see that even when you're writing something as esoteric as literary fiction, there is a sense in which how the world is actually, reading, or its attention spans, in the most populist forms, that has an influence on how we write or how we imagine things. We can't escape it. We can't still keep writing like it's just 200 years back and we are still, having those same resources available to us. And I think one of the things that I wanted to ask you both is to just sort of debunk this myth about literary fiction. And one myth is that, some people say that literary fiction, short stories, for example, are more about character. They are more about sentences, more about language, less about plot. Because somehow people believe that in this false binary that, well, literary fiction is taking care of these aspects, whereas genre-driven fictions worry about lesser things like the plot. And is that something that you really subscribe to? Is that actually true? I mean, personally, I am inclined to disagree with that idea. And I think that's a myth that really floats around, right? So what is your response to that?
Yeah, I think literary fiction as we know it today would have found it very difficult to exist without what we normally call genre fiction. I like to think of these as on the spectrum of simplicity to complexity, right? And if we are able to slot different genres there, I think that would be, to my mind, more accurate. Because Vladimir Nabokov, right? I think he detested the mystery novel, okay? And I think he spoke and wrote about that a lot. And sometimes even lampooning some major mystery writers of the time. But we find that in Lolita, in Pale Fire, right? The opening trope is a murder, right? In some of his most, iconic or popular novels, they are probably not built as mysteries, as whodunit, but they are house stories. How did Humbert end up killing this person, and how did Humbert end up in jail, for example, right? And so, so you can't really say that he was not informed by what Agatha Christie was doing at the time, right? He may have not liked it, but there was a transfusion, so to speak, that happened there. And that is very much like so there are several, if I talk of crime fiction, for example, there are several tropes which what we call commercial crime fiction may use in simple ways because it has a different objective. But murders do happen in what we call literary fiction as well, right? And the trope of the femme fatale, or the trope of describing a scene where the corpse is there. Again, if I can mention Orhan Pamuk, the scene in Snow where bullets are fired on the stage, and he traces every bullet, the path of the 6 bullets that were fired. That's pretty forensic, right? I'm not trying to say that Orhan Pamuk got that energy from reading crime novels, but these things are related. They influence each other. And likewise, do we not read a lot of so-called literary fiction novels that are actually love stories? you know, and are they in some sort of conversation with what is regular romance? I think, so for the market, I think it's necessary to have these classifications, but I would be surprised if, writers could day after day after day think of themselves in a particular slot. There might be a day I wake up and I say, I'm a crime writer now, right? But next day, it changes. And so I think writers cannot be slotted in a genre. The work can be, because a murder might happen with a very, very simple trope. So it becomes a simple mystery novel with a limited set of suspects, and as Borges said, the limited set of suspects in a limited space, and the solution has to be necessary and marvelous. These are his conditions for a mystery novel. And you can write a very, very complex work that would classify as literary with the same rules. Yeah.
I agree with you 100%. I had a short but happy year when I taught English literature to a college, MA and BA and MA and MPhil. And 13 years I taught creative writing in a mathematics school, mathematics students. And I realized that whatever you say during these classes, whatever academics you bring into your conversation with your students about literary fiction, about literature, actually these are after the fact. Like you say, the writer writes, and then he is put into the cubby holes, and unless you have a writer who employs writers to write, and he's a money maker. He sort of makes money and out of his craft, and he knows he will make money, and he writes only to make money. But otherwise, you have your there is an individuality within you which looks at something and says, today I will write about this. It may be similar to what he wrote before because he is the same writer. But it need not be the same genre, it need not be the same type of writing. So academically, it's the step ahead. You examine the thing. In fact, this novel which I said I'm completing now, it's about how the critical nature of literature is sort of taken apart and examined. And that's the thing. This one which I was writing in Scotland.